On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, much of the media celebrate the upset in Alabama after weeks of tough scrutiny of Roy Moore and point the finger at the president.
It's a resounding rejection of everything that Republican and what President Trump was standing for.
That Democrat was elected to the U.S. Senate in an utter repudiation of Steve Bannon and what he stands for, and an utter repudiation, I think, by extension, of Donald Trump and what he stands for.
This was not a referendum on Trump. I feel like it was a referendum on Harvey Weinstein.
Is the press making the Alabama laws too much about Trump? And did journalists help push Doug Jones to victory in the Ruby Red State or hold Roy Moore accountable for alleged sexual misconduct? Media outlets rushing to revive the allegations by women against Trump from back in the campaign and get pushback when they slam the president for a seemingly suggestive tweet against Senator Kirsten Gillibrand.
I think only if your mind is in the gutter would you have read it that way. And so no.
Is the press actively promoting these year-old allegations against Donald Trump? PBS suspends Tavis Smiley's show over allegations of sexual misconduct, and he's fighting back.
Let me also assure you that I have never groped, inappropriately exposed myself, or coerced any colleague in the workplace ever in my 30-year career.
With the New Yorker's Ryan Lizza also contesting his firing for allegedly improper conduct, are many of the accused being tarred with the same brush? Plus, with the premiere of a new film on the Washington Post fighting Richard Nixon over the Pentagon Papers, I'm on the red carpet with Steven Spielberg, Meryl Streep, and Tom Hanks.
I was really drawn to the idea of making a film about Katharine Graham.
We didn't know who Ben Bradley was then. Even Ben said, after that movie came out, everybody would always say, well, you don't look like Jason Robards.
But is it a stretch for these Hollywood stars to draw a link to the current White House? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. Virtually all the pundits thought Roy Moore would probably eke out a win in the Alabama Senate race, and yet most seem rather relieved to be wrong when Democrat Doug Jones scored his upset victory. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Libby Casey, on-air reporter for The Washington Post, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor, and Ruth Marcus, the Post deputy editorial page editor. Libby, has there been a perception that the media in this country, if not out and out opposed to Roy Moore, at least we're ringing the alarm bells about him?
Poynter Institute came out with a recent survey that said 52% of those polled don't trust the media. And Roy Moore was certainly playing into that, talking about fake news, picking up on these hashtags that the president himself has used. And he was pitting himself against not just the elite of Washington, but also the media elite. But I have to say, having talked to the reporters in the Washington Post newsroom who broke the initial story of the allegations, they were just doing their job and they were reporting. And they weren't even fazed by all the attention that was heaped onto them. So it really was not reciprocated, I'm going to say, by the reporters who were doing the actual reporting. Roy Moore may have been lobbing, fights at them, but they just kind of kept doing their job, Howie.
We will come back to that, but Molly, I saw a kind of a celebratory undertone to much of the coverage of Moore's defeat, and not just, liberal places like New York Times editorial page which said sanity reigns, but also National Review, Wall Street Journal editorial page, and other conservative outlets.
Yeah, many people were excited that Roy Moore lost. And I mean, this was a lot of attention paid on this race. I think it speaks both to the strength of journalism, but also the weakness of journalism. Meaning, if this story had come out 5, 10, 15 years ago, that man would have left the race immediately. That he didn't and that he almost won speaks to the credibility problems that the general media establishment has. But on the other hand, the strength of the story, it held up under scrutiny, unlike some of these other people who were trotted out by attorneys and whatnot. The Post story did hold up under scrutiny, so that's a good mark for them. But the danger is that it was even this close means that people aren't trusting or having confidence in the media.
I'm not really sure, Molly, that you can take the failure of Roy Moore to quit the race as indicative of the failure of journalism and the sort of lower standard and the lower profile of journalism in the modern world. Certainly true that there's much more distrust of the media, but I would think that his failure to leave, I was kind of reminded of we were all braced for Clarence Thomas to withdraw. We were all to withdraw when the original allegations came out.
1991.
We were braced. People like me were braced for Bill Clinton to quit when the Monica Lewinsky story erupted. I think, if anything, this is sort of proof that if you just, at least until he lost, proof that if you just stick it out, you can stick it out. Probably more indicative to me of a less control by the party of its own actors than of the failings of the diminished stature of the press
Roy
and
Moore
media.
didn't owe anything to the Republican establishment, but you mentioned the Washington Post, which interviewed the first 4 of 9 accusers on the record in that initial story. One of them later went on TV. You have been doing this online series about journalism. You interviewed the Post reporter Stephanie McCrumman, one of the main Post reporters here. Let's take a quick look at that.
It's not enough just to hear that, someone had an affinity for teenage girls. Well, we have to find out whether there's any reality there.
So if Roy Moore ran against the Washington Post, what he or his people call the lynch mob media, do you think that strategy backfired?
I think it gets, honestly, to a bigger question about the Republican Party and how they're going to put forth candidates and who they represent. Stephanie did not go down to Alabama looking for dirt on candidates. She's an Enterprise reporter. She went down there to talk to Roy Moore supporters about why they were so into this candidate and why they had been a supporter of him for so long because of his stands, as a judge. And she kept hearing these rumors and these stories, and her job was to look into it and to dig into it, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. Your job as a reporter, this isn't the op-ed page, it's a reporter, is to dig into it. And she said she was skeptical when she first heard these stories from people, and so she dug a little more, called an editor and said, I think we have a story here. And the Post sent down a second reporter, and her role was to get to the truth.
Obviously, this is a setback for President Trump because he, after keeping his distance, endorsed Roy Moore, did that rally in Pensacola, did the robocalls, but you heard some of the sound bites, utter repudiation and rebuke. Do you think the press is portraying the Alabama loss as mainly Trump's fault?
There is no question that this was a huge hit for Donald Trump. He did endorse this person. At the same time, this whole race was supposedly about whether you could support a candidate who molests children, and then as soon as yeah. But then as soon as he loses, it all becomes a referendum on Trump, and that seems a little bit tricky. That the goalposts keep getting moved, and it speaks to how I think the media didn't do a good job of understanding what interests Alabama voters and what they were motivated by. Was it 40-year-old accusations of sexual misconduct, or did they have other issues that they cared about? And I'm not sure the media did a good job of covering the rest of the race.
I saw some great stories. I hear your point, and it's a lot of what ends up on television, but I did read a lot of good stories asking voters, about the whys, the hows, the how do you want Alabama to be portrayed in the national media? Why are African American voters so important to this race in particular?
I thought that what was overshadowed was that Roy Moore was a terrible candidate. He barely campaigned. When he did, he kept stepping into new controversies. But what about Molly's point? Was there a shifting of the goalposts, in her words, after Roy Moore loses, and now it's not really about Moore, it's really about Trump?
Well, I think Donald Trump's decision, he shifted the goalposts initially, right? Originally, the White House position was no Senate seat is worth having a pedophile in Congress. Accused pedophile, okay. But that, they said no Senate seat is worth having a child molester in Congress, as did Mark Short, the legislator. And then it was, if true, then these shouldn't be. And then it completely shifted to it's concerning, but it's more important to have a Republican. So, and then the president carefully didn't go to Alabama, but did robocalls, did his Pensacola rally. So he got himself completely aligned with, I'm going to not say in bed with, Roy Moore. And so I don't think that's a shifting goalpost. He made the decision that he was going to support this candidate when the candidate lost, which was clearly as a result of, given the very small, amazing that a Democrat could win.
But it's also missing one of the most important parts of the story, I think, which is that Mitch McConnell intervened in the race during the primary, sabotaged basically a conservative candidate who could have easily won, pouring millions of dollars to make sure that Roy Moore would be the person that his preferred candidate ran against. And this was like a total meddling, and this is a huge Republican issue that I don't think we get enough media coverage of those dynamics.
Let me move you all on to this question of the series of media mistakes, and I'm talking here about ABC's Brian Ross on Mike Flynn. He's suspended for 4 weeks. We had CNN on this supposedly explosive email to Donald Trump Jr. It turned out to be nothing because CNN had the date wrong and the information was public. And then Washington Post Dave Weigel tweeting a half-empty arena, photo of a half-empty arena. It turned out it was hours before Trump spoke. So this came up repeatedly, this sort of thing, at the White House briefing here. Sarah Huckabee Sanders on the media's intentions.
You cannot say that it's an honest mistake when you're purposely putting out information that you know to be false, or when you're taking information that hasn't been validated, that hasn't been offered any credibility, and that has been continually denied by a number of people, including people with direct knowledge of an instance.
Wouldn't news organizations want to avoid intentional mistakes, if only to not have to run an embarrassing correction later?
Absolutely. There's a big difference, though, between an intentional mistake and an actual mistake. Journalists are humans, too. They make mistakes. One thing that we can do is be more transparent. And so when you are a journalist and you make a mistake, apologizing, explaining your process, explaining why and how you got it wrong. And when we get it right, also being transparent, also explaining our process.
But people aren't stupid, and they notice that all of these mistakes go in the same direction. All of these mistakes go against Trump. If it were truly accidental, if it were truly just the cost of doing business, you would see errors going both ways.
No,
and it's
but
not
that
just
could be-
minor.
I think you do.
Molly.
I think you do. We saw that with Fox just recently.
It is important to hold people accountable, and it's important to hold the president accountable. But when you let your bias make you not skeptical about people who are critical of the president, that's also a problem.
I think that's a fair. Let me just jump in here.
Sure.
I think that's a fair point. But again, this question of intentionality. I wrote a column saying these media blunders were really bad, undermined the press's credibility, helped provide ammunition for President Trump. I got a lot of people attacking me online saying, "What do you mean blunders? They're intentional mistakes." And so, is the fake news charge sticking for some folks?
It's irrational for any reporter to intentionally make a mistake that is going to be easily and quickly in this modern media environment disproven. It's going to hurt, if not ruin, his or her career. There is a tendency, I think, because of the modern media environment, where everything happens at lightning speed, to jump the gun too fast. We all, and perhaps in a too snarky way, we all should be really careful of both those things. But it's generally the notion that these are intentional mistakes is, I think, just insane.
I think the problem is, though, that people bought into a Russia collusion narrative, and they bought into it. They started putting a lot of stories, and now, even though they're kind of realizing that there is no collusion to steal an election, they're so embarrassed at how much coverage they gave to this story that turns out that was kind of an information operation, that they aren't able to pull back and correct, because it would make them look bad.
They have corrected.
Well, there
the
have
White
been a
House
lot of
hasn't.
corrections and suspensions.
And we're taking it day by day. Reporters are taking it day by
This
day.
debate will go on, but I have to get a break. When we come back, the press taking on the president over sexual harassment and his swipe at Kirsten Gillibrand. And later, at the big premiere, I asked Meryl Streep about a shot she took at Fox News. As Roy Moore was denying the allegations that helped cost him the Alabama Senate race, White House correspondents increasingly peppered the press secretary with questions about Donald Trump's accusers from 2016.
I wanted to ask you about the women who came forward today against the president.
Look, the president has addressed these accusations directly and denied all of these allegations.
What about your own accusers, though? He has accusers as well.
Look, and can you stand here right now and say without a doubt, 100% certainty that the more than dozen women who have come forward to accuse this president of misconduct are lying?
The sexual allegation circus and the plot to take down the president. In the dangerous climate we have today that the liberals have created, allegations are enough to strip anyone, especially any man, of his career.
And after Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand went on CNN and demanded that Trump resign, the president hit back on Twitter saying, lightweight Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a total flunky for Chuck Schumer, and someone who would come to my office begging for campaign contributions not so long ago and would do anything for them.
Did you interpret that tweet? God, that's sexist. In your head, you're saying that women cannot handle the same insult that a man. And that the weird thing about Trump is he insults everybody.
So, Molly, several of the Trump accusers appear on Megyn Kelly's NBC show. Are the media trying to take a 2016 story, and I'm not saying these aren't serious allegations, and he has denied them repeatedly, and recast it as a 2017 story?
I mean, partly it's legitimate, right? This is the story of the moment, and there are these stories out there. In another way, this is why we have elections. We litigate these things. This behavior by Donald Trump is well known going back decades, and people knowingly elected him president. So there is an aspect to this that does seem a bit old news. In general, though, this is just a story that needs to be covered without people just run to accept any allegation. And I think we need to see a little bit more criticism from the media on that.
What do you make, Ruth, of the media justification that we're in a new environment now, and therefore in the wake of Harvey Weinstein and Louis C.K. and Kevin Spacey and Charlie Rose and Matt Lauer, we should revisit these allegations against Trump for that reason?
Well, I think Molly was right. It was inevitable that it was going to come up. And by the way, the president did tell us not only that these women were liars, but that they would be sued after the election. So kind of waiting for those lawsuits. Meanwhile, there's a defamation lawsuit filed by at least one of the women who's trying to get discovery and like to see the deposition of the president on that one. It is just inevitable that in the Harvey Weinstein et al., and the all keeps growing every day environment, that we were going to be talking about Donald Trump.
Libby, when so many White House correspondents in a row, and we could have shown more of those, asked Sarah Huckabee Sanders about allegations that surfaced a year ago, can it look like the press is pushing this issue?
I think they're following the story because Donald Trump himself opened this door when he talked about Roy Moore, when he said that he didn't even know these women who were accusing him, which he clearly does know them. One of them was an Apprentice contestant, and there was footage of him firing her, on TV. It raises more questions. He said he didn't know the women. Sarah Huckabee Sanders gave it a caveat and said the women who have come out in this press conference. But that was putting a fine point on it that the president himself had not made. And so journalists are going to ask questions. They're going to say, all right, press secretary, what's really going on here? Is he changing his story? So he brings some of this on himself. And when you even have Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador, who's part of Team Trump, saying, accusers should be heard. Women should be heard on this. And including the president in that, that's significant.
Let me get to the tweet about Kirsten Gillibrand because White House says there was no double entendre suggested, but did it resonate for the media because of past Trumpian comments about Mika Brzezinski, Megyn Kelly, and that sort of thing?
I don't know, because Donald Trump has said the exact same thing about Marco Rubio, about Jeb Bush,
begging
about the
for contributions.
Club for Growth. He used to talk about Mitt Romney getting on his knees and begging for money. And it's actually pretty standard rhetoric to say that politicians will do anything for money. The idea that all of a sudden it becomes a sexist insult because a woman is the target of his insult is ludicrous, and it points to how the media way overdo things. Donald Trump is being ridiculous and insulting people, and then they get more ridiculous by saying it's a sexist insult when just saying it's unprecedented.
And by the way,
the president of the United States, though, so every word he says has to be measured in a different way.
But Kirsten Gillibrand went on CNN and said Trump should resign, so she threw a hard punch first.
She threw a hard punch, and we know who the counterpuncher in chief is. That said, I don't think you have to have your mind in the gutter to have taken a sexual innuendo there. And I think he's talked about others begging for money. I don't think he is very much, if at all, talked about others who would do anything. He knew what he was saying.
All right, mine's out of the gutter, and we have to call a halt there. Ruth Marcus, Molly Hemingway, Libby Casey, thanks very much for joining us this Sunday. Ahead, why 21st Century Fox is selling much of the company to Disney and the impact on the news and entertainment business. But up next, a new wave of firings and suspensions over alleged sexual misconduct involving media companies, restaurants, sports, and entertainment figures, and a federal judge. Rupert Murdoch is drawing criticism after a Sky News reporter asked him about the impact on the company of past sexual harassment controversies at Fox News. Murdoch said it's all nonsense and that the company had quickly forced out longtime chairman Roger Ailes, that the criticism was political, and NBC and CBS were now having similar problems, that there are really bad cases where people must be moved aside and others that amount to, quote, a bit of flirting. After a HuffPost report said some women at Fox were upset, 21st Century Fox said in a statement that Murdoch's word nonsense was not about sexual harassment itself, but whether that issue was an obstacle in its bid to buy the rest of Sky News. Under Murdoch, the company said, it has compensated numerous women who were mistreated, fired its biggest star, Bill O'Reilly, and trained virtually all of its employees. Quote, by his actions, Rupert has made it abundantly clear that he understands there were real problems at Fox News, the statement said. Now, questions of sexual misconduct are also spreading to the restaurant business. ABC has fired celebrity chef Mario Batali, co-host of the daytime show The Chew, after the website Eater.com quoted several women as saying he had groped them or sexually harassed them in other ways. Batali is also taking a leave from his company, apologized to those he has hurt, saying, quote, I take full responsibility and am deeply sorry for any pain, humiliation, or discomfort I have caused. The sports world is feeling the impact as well. ESPN has suspended 2 on-air analysts, including former star quarterback Donovan McNabb, over a lawsuit by a wardrobe stylist alleging numerous graphic instances of sexual harassment and assault. And the suit prompted the NFL Network to suspend 3 former football players who had been working as on-air analysts. The federal bench is not immune. The Washington Post reporting yesterday that 9 more women, for a total of 15, have accused high-profile appeals court judge Alex Kozinski of inappropriate conduct, including unwanted kissing and touching. And the New York Times and LA Times have interviewed several women who accuse music mogul Russell Simmons of rape. Simmons, who has stepped down from his company, insists he's innocent. More on this in our next segment, including Salma Hayek writing for the New York Times on how Harvey Weinstein sexually tormented her, and Tavis Smiley fighting his suspension by PBS. And later, Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep, Steven Spielberg on why they believe their film about the Pentagon Papers has resonance for today's attacks on the press. Things can get very personal, even nasty, in the incestuous media world. It began when Senator Kirsten Gillibrand called on Donald Trump to resign. The president fired off that tweet about how she'd do anything for campaign contributions. MSNBC's Mika Brzezinski slammed the president for that and said that if his press secretary backed her boss on this, she should resign.
Sarah Huckabee Sanders, good luck today in the briefing. Don't lie and do not defend the president of the United States for what he did.
Well, that brought a blast from former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee defending his daughter on Fox, and Joe Scarborough shot back on behalf of his fiancée.
I was stunned that of all the people who are going to give a lecture on morality and family and marriage, it's going to be Mika. Mika can go.
Now from New York, Guy Benson, political editor of townhall.com, and Jessica Tarloff, senior director at bustle.com, both are Fox News contributors. So, Guy, what do you make of Mika Brzezinski attacking Sarah Huckabee Sanders and saying if you defend your boss on this Kirsten Gillibrand tweet, you should go, you should quit?
Well, I think that attack was premised on a false assumption that the tweet itself was sexist. The president says sexist things sometimes and has done sexist things in the past, but in my opinion, this tweet was not sexist. And Molly Hemingway, I think, made that case earlier in your program. He has said the exact same thing with the exact same formulation about male Republicans in the not too distant past. So then that sort of began a cascade of counterattacks from various family members, fiancés, fathers. It got personal, and sometimes when it gets personal, it gets ugly.
Yeah, Jessica, you know, it's understandable Mike Huckabee would come to the defense of his daughter, but Joe Scarborough is also right that Mika Brzezinski hadn't talked about marriage or family. What did you make of all the sniping?
Well, I made 2 things. First of all, on the premise of what the tweet actually signified, I completely agree that Donald Trump insults men and women. I think that he needs to be careful not to insult women in this way. And because she had said specifically something about the charges of him sexually assaulting, I think it's up to 19 women, I feel that he did go after her in that way specifically, and it was sexist. My second point is that what these cable news hosts are doing and pundits, when we get up here and we fight like that, we are further turning America off. They don't want to see Joe Scarborough and Mike Huckabee have a fight about their respective loved ones. Stick to the news as much as you can. I know opinion is fun, and I'd certainly love to express mine, but I think that's why you have sinking faith in the media.
Right. Let's go to Omarosa, who is leaving the White House, either fired or resigned, depending on whose account you believe. She has been in a feud with the radio reporter and CNN contributor April Ryan. Take a brief look.
The assertion that
Ryan says she's doing her job, but she formerly was friends with Omarosa, and they have been feuding for a while.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a personal vendetta here. Maybe there is. I think there is overall a vendetta on behalf of April Ryan against this White House, going back to the stupid allegations about whether Sarah Huckabee Sanders baked her own pie, saying that, oh, I wasn't invited to the Christmas party, but if I had been, I wouldn't have gone anyway. It does seem like April Ryan goes beyond just being a reporter frequently.
Right.
She's a commentator, an activist on the left. She does her job. That includes some reporting, but I think to claim that she's just a journalist, just a straight reporter, to me, the evidence suggests otherwise.
Just briefly, Jessica, are the media giving too much attention to the departure of Omarosa, who was not exactly a major figure in the White House?
Yeah, absolutely. There was that amazing Daily Beast article about how she was followed around and no one could figure out what it is that she actually does. I presume that's why she was fired in the end, and that John Kelly thought there is no reason to be paying this person a bunch of money so that she can have her bridesmaids come in, open presents, and have a luncheon. So I think that's what was going on here. But I have a very high opinion of April Ryan, and I don't think she was making this up.
All right, disagreement there. Let me move to these FBI texts, these 2 FBI agents, one of whom, Peter Strzok, was removed by Robert Mueller from the investigation. Let's put some of the messages up on the screen. He is writing to his girlfriend, Lisa Page. God, Trump is loathsome human, yet he may win. Good for Hillary, it is. And if we can move on, Peter Strzok, oh my God, he's an idiot. Lisa Page, awful, is also a reference to insurance policy. So, Guy, there's an issue here about whether this stuff should have been leaked and shared to the press, and there's also an issue about whether it undermines the credibility of the investigation.
Well, I think the American people had the right to see what these text messages were, because Strzok was fired or demoted or thrown off this investigation months ago. We knew that he had departed Mueller's team, but we didn't know why. And then it took a long time. Congress didn't even know why. It took a long time for us to figure out what the case was. And if there were references to anti-Trump, pro-Hillary text messages, I think for journalistic transparency, it was right for the media to try to get their hands on those and give them to viewers and to readers. To me, you just ran through some of those examples of what was sent back and forth, and some of it was just sort of sniping, and people are going to have their political opinions.
Right.
And obviously, they didn't love Mr. Trump. But to me, the most important one, or the most potentially problematic message, was about that insurance policy against the Trump presidency. To me, that raises a red flag. And on the media side of this, Howie, Byron York tweeted over the weekend that he did a search of the New York Times and Washington Post websites, and the insurance policy element of those texts was never mentioned in a single news story about this controversy.
Okay, so I think that needed more coverage. But Jessica, let me point you to something that Jesse Waters said on his Fox show last night. Let's put it up. He was talking about the investigation. He said, we may now have evidence the FBI meant to destroy the Trump presidency for partisan purposes. In fact, we have, if it's true, we have a coup on our hands in America. So critics on your side saying Fox News, or some Fox commentators, they really should say, are trying to discredit this investigation any way they can.
Yeah, and I think that's an accurate criticism. And it's not just people on my side of the aisle. There are a number of Republicans who feel very strongly that Bob Mueller should be able to proceed, as he has been, with the full confidence of the government, and certainly not the President of the United States of America slandering them nonstop, even at graduations. We know that Christopher Wray and Rod Rosenstein have both said that they have full confidence in this investigation and how Bob Mueller is running it. I completely agree with Guy that the text that matters is about the insurance policy and the idea that these characters were sitting around in Andy McCabe's office talking about what would be done. We don't know if anything happened.
Since you both agree on one point, I'm going to call a halt there. Guy Benson and Jessica Tarlov, thanks very much for a great debate.
Howie. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next on Media Buzz, the media tizzy as Omarosa gets canceled. Oh, that's what I was supposed to read last time. Next on Media Buzz, we put the right script up. A look at Tavis Smiley being fired by PBS and Ryan Lizza suspended by the New Yorker. PBS has suspended Tavis Smiley's talk show after an outside law firm found what it called multiple and credible allegations of misconduct. Variety reports that Smiley had sexual relationships with a number of subordinates who were worried that their job status was tied to these relationships and expressed concern about retaliation. But Smiley is strongly disputing the findings.
It is clear that this has gone too far, and I, for one, intend to fight back. PBS overreacted, and they launched a sloppy investigation.
Joining us now from New York is Lynn Sher, former correspondent for ABC News. So Tavis Smiley, I think, is the first major TV figure to fight back in one of these cases. He's saying he had a consensual relationship, at least in one case. PBS won't give him the name of the accusers. Without PBS providing the details, how are we supposed to judge whether there's a big problem here?
They're going to have to release the details at some point, and certainly anybody who is accused has the right to find out. We need to differentiate, Howie. This drip, 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 which is now a flood, the only way we can avoid drowning in it is to differentiate, find out the facts, differentiate between something that destroys a woman's career and something that just makes her want to go take a shower alone. There's a difference between these things, and we need to find it out. And I think what Tavis Smiley is getting, I know nothing about his case. I do know that when he says we need to start the conversation, that's the point. We're never going to ban sex in the workplace, although I have a feeling there'll be a lot less mistletoe at holiday parties this year, which might be a good thing.
Yeah.
But we need to determine the boundaries. We need to have a way to say to each other what's right, what works, what's okay, and what's not okay.
Right. Similar questions are being raised about the New Yorker magazine firing Ryan Lizza, who'd been the Washington correspondent for a decade. He's also a CNN contributor. Network's reviewing his case. And in that case, the New Yorker is saying that he engaged in improper sexual misconduct, but not saying exactly what it is. Now, Ryan Lizza may be best known for reporting on that raunchy, off-the-record, or he supposedly, he says it was on the record, excuse me, conversation with Anthony Scaramucci, which cost him his job at the White House. Let's take a brief look at that.
I named it Insane Scaramucci Interview because it was just so completely unlike any on-the-record conversation I'd had with a spokesman for the White House.
And then let me read you Ryan Lizza's comments. I'm dismayed that the New Yorker has decided to characterize a respectful relationship with a woman I dated as somehow inappropriate. But the woman hired a lawyer to complain. And again, we don't know the details, and it goes to your point about how do you differentiate among these cases.
Well, this is what a lot of people are now talking about, because there is some concern that there's backlash. There is some concern that everything gets lumped together, and it shouldn't be. My friend Alan Alda, the great actor, of course, who's been a great supporter of women's rights for many decades, said to me the other night, what we should do is have a safe word, one phrase that is universally recognized as something that means you can't do it anymore. Now, I think the word stop is fine. I think the word no is fine. I think Hillary Clinton's book where she said, back up, you creep, was a perfectly good idea. But if those are too subtle, what Alan Alda suggests is something like, that's not okay. Make that a universally accepted quick phrase that even bystanders can use if they see something going on. There have to be lines drawn. Women should not have to bear the onus of this. We should not have to police it, but something has to be done.
And finally, let me ask you about what I thought was a very moving piece by actress Salma Hayek in the New York Times about Harvey Weinstein. Obviously, we've heard many allegations about the movie mogul. And she says, you know, he asked her for sex, asked to watch her take a shower, accept a massage, and all that, and had bullied her, and even said at one point, I could kill you or I will kill you. But in this piece, she says also that he pushed her into doing a nude scene with another actress, Ashley Judd. She had a nervous breakdown. But really, the question here is, she says she was too much of a coward to come forward before this against what she calls this monster. Your brief thoughts.
Howie, I've got two reactions to that. One is when I read that really gut-wrenching piece by Salma Hayek, I remembered when I was the sexual harassment ombudsperson at ABC News back in the 80s. Young women would come to me trembling. I felt their trembling when I read that piece. This is a horrifying thing for women to go through. And back then, these women were way too frightened to even bump it up to the next level, let alone publish it in the New York Times.
And of course, Salma Hayek was an unknown actress at the time that a lot of this took place, not the big star that she is today. We got to leave it there. Lynn Scherer, thanks very much for becoming our correspondent on these matters. Thanks for joining us. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Howie.
After the break, I talked to Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks about playing Katharine Graham and Ben Bradley in the film about the huge risk of publishing secret Pentagon documents.